Okay, this is the online lecture part 2 for chapter 5. So let's get started. Before I get started, I just want you guys to know where I got the top graphic from. This is poultry that looks like Kim Kardashian. So I don't know how I searched that or why I searched that, but that's where that thing came from. All right, anyway, let's get started with product yield. Okay, product yield is used a lot in kitchens. This is something that we look at every single time we purchase a product that is to be used in the kitchen. It doesn't matter if those are vegetables or if it's poultry or if it's fish. It doesn't matter. We always look at the product yield, and the reason for that is we want to look at the whole product that we're purchasing and what part of that product are we going to be able to use, or what part of that product are we going to throw away? And the reason we look at this is because we're trying to determine if it is worth our time, effort, and also finances to purchase a product in its original state or already partially, let's say, prepared, right? So taking a look at the chicken, is it worth our time to buy a whole chicken, or should we already buy it, as drumsticks if that's what we actually need? So that's kind of what we're looking at. So as mentioned, the product yield, when calculating it, there are two forms that we're looking at. The AP, which means as purchased. So that is literally the weight that the product comes in as. So if we're looking at the whole chicken, it includes the weight of the gizzard, of the liver, of whatever comes inside of the chicken. If we're looking at corn, okay, this, if it's the AP state, potentially it might already be the actual, the leaves that cover the corn or whatever it may be, right? So this is the as purchased. We pay for the entire thing. So the weight even of products that we potentially cannot use and will throw away. The EP, the edible portion, refers to the weight of a product after it has been cleaned, trimmed, but also cooked and portioned. So this also means everything that is done, when we're ready to serve it to the customer. And as everybody knows, as a product cooks or as we prepare it, it obviously loses something. So typically what kitchen managers or chefs do, they actually perform something called a yield test. And this is essentially where we're looking at calculating the actual EP cost of a product, because we know that it's going to experience some loss during cooking or preparation. So if I buy a roasted chicken for $2.99, okay, a pound, that's not actually what it costs me, because there are parts of that chicken that I can't use. So I'm paying for product that I cannot make money off of. So I actually have to make sure to calculate whatever the waste of that product is so that I ensure that I'm pricing that chicken correctly. So if you can imagine, that chicken is going to cost more because I cannot charge my customers for products that, that I cannot. I have to charge, let me rephrase that. I have to charge my customers for even the product that I cannot make money off of. Okay. So we're looking at a product yield formula, which we look at the product as its original state, then whatever it loses during preparation, and that is what it's going to get us our product EP. So that is how we get that edible portion, right? If you've ever worked in a kitchen, you also might be, they reference this as a butcher's yield test. That's essentially what we do, because we're looking at, that's essentially a butcher. A lot of times when I was training my butchers at my former restaurant, I would actually have them do this and keep a log of their butcher's yield. So let's say they were filleting a salmon, right? So they would take the whole salmon, they would put it on the scale, and they would weigh it. And then they would have two bins, one for the product that we're actually going to use and one for their excess, right? So as they were trimming the salmon, filleting the salmon, anything that they took off that was quote unquote unusable products, such as the tail or the skin or whatever it was, we would weigh that to ensure that we could, calculate their butcher's yield and see how good they were at filleting and how much yield they could actually get out of a whole salmon. So obviously the best butchers got the highest yield because they cut the closest to the bone, the closest to the skin. And I know some of you guys are like, well, yeah, but you could use the bones and the skin for a broth. Sure, you can. Unfortunately, we didn't have a seafood broth on our menu, so we actually could not. So there you are. So sometimes you could, sometimes you could not. So when we're looking at the yield test, and when we're looking, we could either get a waste percentage or a yield percentage. So obviously waste percentage is what you are using, what you're losing, and then the yield percentage is what you're using, right? So if you're looking at something like the salmon, obviously whatever was the product loss, so the weight of the product that we could not use, we would divide that by the as purchased weight, which means the original weight, right? And then we would get whatever the waste percentage is. So originally we were looking at a roasted chicken, so we could kind of look at this as an example for the roasted chicken. So we could take something like a rotisserie chicken and look at its AP weight. Now, when you're doing something like this, and there's many different ways to do this, and we look at math, and I try to simplify it as much as I can, but you guys can obviously look at it whichever you're looking at it. I looked at something where obviously very rarely do you get a chicken that's exactly the right amount of pounds. So it's something, a couple of pounds, couple of ounces, whatever it is. So I always like to convert it to the same unit. So if the AP weight of a chicken is 7 pounds and 5 ounces, we want to make sure we convert all of that to the ounces. So that actually comes out to 117 ounces, right? And then after the chicken is roasted, obviously it loses a lot of stuff. We took some stuff out, whatever it is. We know that the EP weight, the edible portion weight of the chicken is 5 pounds, 2 ounces. So obviously converted that into ounces. And simple math right there. We know that there was loss during the cooking process. We take that loss, which ends up being 35 ounces. We divide it by the original weight, which was 117 ounces. And we see that the waste percentage of the roasted chicken is 29.9%, which means that ultimately the chicken had almost a 30% loss. So obviously this can be flipped into looking at what the yield of the chicken is, which obviously turn around the formula, and we see that the yield of the roasted chicken was 70.1%. So obviously that is the edible portion, that's a usable product that we can get. Now, obviously, this is something, if you are doing purchasing for a restaurant, there's a lot of purveyors that will actually tell you the yield of their product. So they will tell you this yields, 70%, this yields 80%, because they already have that, figured out so that you can make that decision. Obviously, if something like chicken, if it has a lot of fat, it's going to weigh way more as an AP state, and then it's going to lose way more during the cooking state. So a more lean product is not going to lose as much. So that's kind of a good thing also to keep in mind. Now, how do we actually use yield percentage in purchasing? Well, it's really important to know, because obviously for purchasing decisions, by knowing what the yield is, it's going to help us make the right purchasing decisions. Obviously, if I need, let's say, if I'm buying vegetables and I need 50 pounds of potatoes for a specific recipe to make mashed potatoes for a certain amount of people. Well, if I know something about potatoes, I know that I have to peel them before I cook them, right? Well, the weight of the peels is included in what I'm paying for, the 50 pounds. And if I need 50 pounds for my actual recipe, I know that if I buy 50 pounds of potatoes, I'm actually going to be short. So I need to understand what is the yield on a potato, so that I buy extra to include the weight of the peels, right? So that I have the 50 pounds that I actually need for my recipe after I peel them. So when we're looking at something like this, that was an example that I have for potatoes, but we can do it for anything, right? So something like a pork loin. Pork loin, we know that there's pretty good yield on a pork loin, but depending on, if it has a fat cap, it has anything like that, we also have to understand that you're purchasing the right amount. So we're looking at a kitchen manager who needs to have a 12-ounce portion that he's serving to the guests. So if he's, serving a 12-ounce portion, it should weigh, not all restaurants do this, but it should be 12 ounces after cooking. Because if I put in a 12-ounce loin and I cook it, it's obviously going to shrink down. So the chef here, he needs a 12-ounce loin. He knows that there's a yield of 72.8% on this specific pork loin. So to ensure that he is serving an EP, an edible portion, to his guests at 12 ounces by using the yield percentage that he has, he understands that he needs to purchase 16.48 or 16.5 ounce pork loins. Okay, so there you are. That's kind of how we are looking to go ahead and do this. And obviously, another way to determine this is just to flip the formula around. This is just showing you guys how, different items can be figured out using the same formula and flipping it around. And your book does a really good job at explaining it as well. So once again, looking at the formula and looking back at what we actually know and understand about the cost and how to determine an actual cost of a product, knowing that we're going to lose something, that's called the edible portion cost. And we're looking at something like this and understanding what yield is, and then looking at what the actual costs are for these products given a certain yield. So looking at going back to that original recipe with the roasted chicken, where we were looking at a roasted chicken and the AP cost per pound was $1.99. So that sounds really good. If I'm a kitchen manager, I'm like, wow, that's great, because I'm looking at that original cost. But it's really important to understand that, obviously, that might not be the actual cost, given the fact that, I have some loss and I don't yield 100% from an actual roasted chicken. So if the AP cost per pound is $1.99, we know that the yield that we calculated is 70.1. If we go ahead and take that AP price per unit and we divide it by the yield, we actually find out that the edible portion cost per unit is $2.84. That is higher. That's, almost $1 higher than what the original price is, but this is something that we need to understand. When we're looking at a price like this actually might come out to, if we see another roasted chicken from another purveyor that's maybe a little bit higher in price, but has a better yield because it's not as fatty, or it doesn't have the gizzard or the heart inside. And if we're not making chicken broth or stock or anything like that, we might not need it. So that's something that we might look at, maybe a higher priced AP chicken with a higher yield in the end will actually end up costing us less. And when we're looking at determining, actual cost and attainable cost, this is kind of the same thing that we used. Remember when we did percentage of budget or anything like that? So once again, we can actually use a lot of these same formulas to find out different things. So even as a kitchen manager, we're always looking at, how close are we to what our costs that we hope to have compared to the costs that, what we predicted and also what we actually have, right? So we kind of try to always measure ourselves. So going back to these examples of potentially, or the purchases that we make and measuring these as kitchen managers, we can kind of use a really similar formula that we used for those budgets, where we're actually looking at what our actual product costs are and then what our attainable product costs are, meaning of what our budgets are, right? And even on a kitchen manager level, we could see how efficient we are in our purchasing. So this is just another tool that we use as kitchen managers to kind of help see how good we are literally at our job. Now, just like when we were looking at the budgets and comparing actual budgets to, actual numbers to budgeted numbers. This is the same thing on a level of kitchen management that we also look at, because we're looking at what are our numbers compared to our budget. So what is the total of all our invoices compared to what we were hoping to have? But we also need to look at that it helps us calculate different things that happen in the kitchens, because not everything, not all of our losses come from cutting or anything like that. They also can come from over portioning or not cooking things correctly or not portioning things correctly. I remember I had a brand new line cook one time, prep cook, I'm sorry, and I walked over and he was slicing cabbage, and I walked over and I was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm slicing cabbage. And he was literally taking the head of cabbage and slicing it in half and throwing away the bottom portion of the cabbage. And I was like, no, this is, where we serve coleslaw, we serve tons of coleslaw. I said, you need to portion this correctly. And he was like, nobody ever taught me that. But yet, if I let him and I didn't remedy that, or my kitchen manager did not remedy that, we would have lost that entire, he was doing like 10 cases that day. So just looking at how much we actually would have lost, that would have made a huge difference in our final numbers.